Welcome back to our news channel. In today's news, as anti-immigrant sentiment surges in Europe, under-threat leaders are embracing formerly taboo approaches to their borders. But before we continue, please stay tuned and ensure you like our video, subscribe if you haven't done so. Brussels. While no European leader or bureaucrat has threatened to deport 20 million people or ban Muslims, except perhaps former President Donald Trump's favorite European, Hungarian strongman Viktor Orbán, the European Union and Trump are closer on the issue of migration than words may suggest. EU countries have individually pushed to crack down on migration after substantial surges in support for anti-immigrant parties in various European elections this year. While they mostly eschew the racist, xenophobic rhetoric Trump uses to describe immigrants, in the cold, hard light of policy, their positions are not all so different. At a meeting in Brussels, EU leaders spent hours discussing migrant processing centers, speedier deportations, and hybrid warfare by hostile powers using migrants to destabilize EU countries. "A new wind is blowing in Europe," said the Dutch anti-Islam, anti-immigration populist Freedom Party leader Geert Wilders in Brussels on Thursday after a meeting of far-right leaders. Migration has been at the forefront for Europe's politicians since 2015, when more than 1 million migrants, many of them Syrians fleeing war, made their way to the bloc. In the ensuing decade, the EU collective has shifted from the "we can do it" stance of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel to trying to shoo new arrivals away from the EU border altogether. In 2023, fewer than 300,000 people made it to the continent. This year, the EU's border agency, Frontex, estimates about 160,000 migrants have reached Europe. In recent months, nearly a dozen European countries have instituted some form of border restrictions in an attempt to deter migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Poland this month announced a temporary halt to processing asylum requests from migrants arriving from neighboring Belarus, invoking a security threat. Germany's Olaf Scholz instituted border controls this summer to stop undocumented migrants from crossing into Germany after a Syrian man stabbed 11 people, killing 3. 6 other countries, including Italy, France, and Austria, have introduced border checks. Some analysts say if Trump were to return to the White House, it would put more wind in the sails of those who have matched and mirrored his administration's ambitions on migration. Certainly, many member states that have pushed for a restrictive approach to migration will be watching the American elections very closely. This will give EU countries pushing for more restrictions further bargaining chips to push for their preferences both in the US as well as in the EU, said Alberto Horst Neidhart, head of European Migration and Diversity at the European Policy Center. The vague terminology around return hubs and processing centers mirrors Trump's migrant protection program. The initiative, colloquially known as Remain in Mexico, took effect in 2019 and forced tens of thousands of non-Mexican migrants back across the U.S. border to Mexico to await migration decisions there. In a letter to leaders this week, Ursula von der Leyen, head of the EU's executive branch, endorsed the idea of what she called return hubs, buildings to detain migrants in non-EU countries. Spain's prime minister, a relatively lonely voice on the matter, on Thursday rejected the idea after the EU leaders met. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has inaugurated processing centers in Albania where people headed to Italy will be transported, echoing Australia's policy of sending asylum seekers to Papua New Guinea to have their claims processed. Meanwhile, France is pushing to change EU law to facilitate deportations to third countries. And the EU already has thousands of kilometers of physical fencing at its external borders, a setup that far exceeds Trump's ballyhooed but abortive border wall with Mexico. Some experts argue that the mainstreaming of hardline rhetoric is leading to policy changes that favor Europe's rights. If you listen to Orbán and Meloni at times and others like France's far-right leader Marine Le Pen over the years, the rhetoric has been as harsh and as virulent as what we hear from politicians like Trump in the United States, said Judith Sunderland, Associate Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. There is an intent to make it sound like it's legal, like it is in line with international law. The policy changes have similar aims to those of Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, reducing the number of new arrivals and sending people back to their countries of origin, even if those places are potentially unstable or unsafe. We have to recognize the current solutions don't work, said one EU diplomat who was granted anonymity to speak candidly about the conversation. That is something Trump and many EU leaders would agree on. The major difference, though, is in style and tone. Europeans tend to tiptoe around contentious issues. Take the D word, deportations. For Trump, who has vowed to deport between 15 and 20 million people from the U.S. if re-elected in November, using the word deportation is a badge of honor. Under the Trump administration, if you came in illegally, you were apprehended immediately and you were deported, the Republican presidential hopeful crowed at a rally in July. That's why, to keep our family safe, the Republican platform promises to launch the largest deportation operation in the history of our country. For European leaders and officials, though, the D word, which is linked for many in Europe to Nazi deportations to death camps during World War II, is almost taboo. The bloc's officials speak gingerly of returns or return hubs to describe the enclosed camps or detention centers they've set up outside the EU. And when it comes to describing how migrants reach its borders, EU leaders tend to tread carefully again. While Trump has no qualms about qualifying some migrants as illegal and decrying illegal immigration, in the EU, migration that doesn't come via airports or other official routes is officially described as irregular. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is the one EU leader to buck the trend, doing away with European niceties and fully embracing Trump-style rhetoric and straight-up villainizing migrants with his right-wing nationalist stance. The strongman leader vowed earlier this month to bus migrants to Brussels, copying a similar vow by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who sent migrants in his state to Martha's Vineyard, a posh vacation spot in Massachusetts. I have been chest-deep in the bloodbath of the migration debate for quite some time, Orbán recently told a press conference in Brussels, channeling Trump. But it's not all smooth sailing for Europe's migration hardliners. Some leaders are facing setbacks in real time. This week, Meloni proclaimed Italy's migration policy a model for Europe. But on Thursday, while she gathered with other European leaders in Brussels, her offshore detention centers in Albania hit their first hurdle. 4 of the 16 migrants sent to Albania have already been put on a boat back to Italy because they were children or were considered vulnerable. Only male adults who are not considered vulnerable can be taken to Albania after a screening at sea under Italy's own rules. Opposition groups and NGOs immediately called the project a failure. It will have very real consequences on people around the world, potentially, because those other countries look at what the EU is doing to them and say, well, why should we guarantee people's rights? Said Sunderland from Human Rights Watch. The bigger concern for some critics is that harsh rhetoric and measures on migration will open the door to other policies. Migration has become a Trojan horse for conservative forces to push then an agenda that goes beyond migration, said the European Policy Center's Neidhart. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode of SN Visa and Immigration News.